Rommel saw it coming. Not the landing, not the beaches, the moment after. The moment the Allies stopped surviving and started moving. The moment the war stopped being a question of who could endure and became a question of who could decide the timeline. He understood one thing better than most of Germany's leadership. The Americans were going to move faster than anyone expected. Not faster in a headline, faster in a way that breaks an army's ability to respond. Faster in a way that turns a problem into a collapse before your paperwork finishes breathing. And he knew exactly what Patton would try to do when he got room to operate. Rommel warned them. Germany ignored it. And the price was paid in days they couldn't afford. That's the part people miss. They think warnings are about danger. Rommel's warning was about time. About the fact that a modern battlefield has a rhythm. And the side that owns the rhythm owns everything else. Orders, reserves, supply lines, even morale. Because morale isn't a feeling, it's a calculation. Can we still catch up? Can we still close the gap? Can we still stop the next punch? When the answer becomes no, the map changes, even if the borders don't. Rommel's entire career was built on tempo. He didn't become Rommel by being cautious. He became Rommel by forcing other commanders to live inside his schedule. He moved when they were still discussing. He hit where they were still looking. He made an enemy feel late. And once an enemy feels late, they start making decisions for the past instead of the future. That meant he didn't respect noise, he respected motion. So when he studied the Americans, he didn't see softness. He didn't see inexperience. He saw capacity. He saw the sheer weight of production behind them. He saw fuel and trucks and radios and air support and replacement troops, not as individual advantages, as a single advantage, a system that could keep moving. And then he looked at Patton. Most people start with the personality, the speeches, the showmanship, the arrogance, the headlines. Rommel didn't. Rommel looked past the theater, because a battlefield doesn't care how loud you are. It only cares what you do when something breaks. Rommel saw a commander who would exploit hesitation instantly. A commander who didn't wait for conditions to be perfect, because he understood something deeper. Perfection is a trap. If you wait for perfection, you give your enemy time to become ready. You give them time to stabilize. You give them time to make mistakes safely. Patton didn't make mistakes safe. That meant Rommel's warning wasn't vague. It wasn't philosophical. It was simple. Give him space, and he will turn it into collapse. Because Patton had a pattern. It was visible, it was repeatable, and it was brutal. Pressure, momentum, no pause. Not secure, then advance. Advance and security will follow. Not hold until everything is aligned. Move and alignment will be forced. Not wait for clarity. Create clarity by breaking the enemy's ability to think. That meant Patton didn't need a perfect plan. He needed one mistake from you. One delay. One gap. One argument between commanders. One order that arrives late. One unit that hesitates because it doesn't know if it's allowed to move. And then it's too late. Because when Patton found a crack, he didn't patch it. He widened it. He pushed into it, expanded it, made it swallow everything around it. He treated small failures like doors, not like problems. He turned local confusion into operational disaster. So when Rommel imagined Patton with room to maneuver, he didn't imagine a strong American attack. He imagined a chain reaction. He imagined a front line that doesn't just bend, it loses its shape. That meant the danger wasn't Patton's tanks by themselves. It wasn't his infantry by itself. It wasn't even his personal genius, not in isolation. The danger was what speed does to a command system. Because command systems have a limit. They can handle pressure, they can handle casualties, they can even handle surprises, but they struggle with speed. Speed doesn't just change positions on a map, it changes what information means. A report that says enemy breakthrough here is useful when you have time. When you don't, it becomes a death certificate for the decisions you made an hour ago. So when Rommel warned them, he wasn't just talking about a man, he was talking about physics. About what happens when one side moves faster than the other side can think. That meant Germany had two options. adapt to tempo, or let tempo become the weapon that kills them. This is where the story becomes personal. Rommel respected Patton because Rommel respected himself, not his ego, his method, his obsession, his understanding that wars are not won by being strong, they're won by being early. Early to the gap, early to the crossing, early to the crossroads, early to the enemy's back. Rommel had done it to others. He knew what it felt like from the other side. The panic, the confusion, the feeling that your enemy is already where you plan to be tomorrow. And he knew that once you feel that, you start lying to yourself. You tell yourself, we can stabilize. You tell yourself, this is temporary. You tell yourself, we just need one clean counterattack. You tell yourself, they have to pause. That's the lie tempo punishes, because sometimes they don't pause. Sometimes they can keep going. Sometimes their entire system is designed to keep going. That meant Rommel didn't ask, can the Americans break through? He asked, if they break through, how fast can we respond? And when he looked at the answers, at the delays, at the bureaucracy, at the command friction, he saw a disaster waiting for a date. So when people talk about warnings, they imagine a dramatic moment, a general slamming a table, a prophetic speech. That's not how real warnings work. Real warnings are inconvenient. They demand changes that cost money, pride, and control. And Germany's leadership did not want inconvenient truth. They wanted comforting belief. That meant the problem wasn't information, it was denial with a uniform. Germany's leadership wanted answers that let them keep their plan. Because changing your plan is an admission. It's saying, my previous assumptions were wrong. And in a rigid system, especially one built on ideology and certainty, being wrong is not a technical issue. It's a threat. So accurate warnings became dangerous, not because they were false, because they were expensive. If you accept Rommel's logic, you must move. You must shift reserves. You must loosen control. You must place authority where speed is possible. You must stop pretending you can micromanage a war at that scale. You must build a defense that reacts in minutes and hours, not in days. That meant accepting Rommel also meant accepting vulnerability. And vulnerability was not a language Germany's leadership wanted to speak. So they did what losing systems often do. They dismissed the threat because acknowledging it would force them to change. They treated the warning like a complaint, like pessimism, like a general being dramatic. They told themselves, we've handled threats before. They told themselves, we'll contain it. They told themselves, the Americans are predictable. They told themselves, even if one commander is aggressive, we can manage him. That meant they misunderstood what Rommel was saying. Rommel wasn't saying, Patton is dangerous. He was saying, Patton will decide the timeline if you let him. And once your enemy decides the timeline, your choices stop being choices. They become reactions. Reactions are always late. So when the moment arrived, when Patton had the space, the fuel, the green light, what happened wasn't surprising. It was inevitable. Not because Patton was unstoppable, but because tempo creates inevitability. That meant the battlefield didn't have to be lost in a single heroic moment. It could be lost quietly, in meetings, in delays, in arguments, in orders waiting for approval, in reserves that should have moved yesterday. Rommel understood that. He respected the logic. He respected the tempo. Germany didn't. And once you ignore reality, reality doesn't negotiate. If you're here for this kind of cause and consequence history, where the story is built like a ticking clock, you'll want the rest of it. Not because it gets louder, because it gets tighter. Because once the first crack appears, everything becomes a race. And races don't reward pride. The warning was never abstract. It wasn't a vague sense of danger floating in the air. It was a practical message with a timer attached. Rommel understood that Normandy wasn't just a battlefront. It was a trap made of geography and air power. Roads that could be watched, bridges that could be destroyed, columns that could be pinned in place from above. Once the Allies were established, every German move would happen under a ceiling of enemy aircraft. That meant the only time Germany could move freely was before the ceiling closed. That meant the defense had to be immediate. Not eventually. Not after confirmation. Not after permission. Immediate. Because speed wasn't just a preference anymore. It was survival. Rommel's logic was brutally simple. If the Allies landed, they would build a foothold. If they built a foothold, they would pour in men and machines. If they poured in men and machines, the front would stop being a line and become a pressure system. And pressure systems don't get weaker with time. They get stronger. So when Rommel talked about what had to happen, he talked about the first hours, the first day, the first chance to hit them before they could breathe, hit them before they become a system. That meant reserves mattered more than heroism. That's the uncomfortable truth. People love to talk about courage. Courage is real, but it isn't enough. A courageous unit that arrives late is still late. A brilliant counterattack that starts tomorrow is still tomorrow. Tempo doesn't care how brave you are. Tempo only asks one question. Did you arrive in time to matter? Rommel wanted armor positioned close enough to respond quickly. He wanted authority close enough to decide quickly. He wanted a plan that could move with the speed the battlefield demanded. Because he knew what Allied air power would do once daylight came. It would freeze movement. It would turn roads into kill zones. It would make maneuver a fantasy. That meant if German armor wasn't already in place or already moving, by the time the Allies started expanding, the window would close. And when a window closes in war, it doesn't close gently, it slams. So Rommel's warning wasn't, they will be strong. It was, you will not be able to move the way you think you can move. That's what makes a warning expensive. It doesn't just demand more effort. It demands a different relationship with control. It demands decentralization. It demands trust. It demands decisions that are allowed to happen without asking a distant voice for permission. And Germany's system was not built for that. Germany's leadership didn't just ignore Rommel's warning, they were structurally incapable of honoring it. Because honoring it meant admitting that the old way of commanding was too slow. That meant the real enemy was friction. Not American soldiers, not British tanks. Friction inside the German system. Friction between authority and reality. Friction that turns minutes into hours, hours into days, and then days into losses you can't reverse. Rommel was a field commander who lived in the present tense. He cared about what the battlefield looked like right now. Germany's high command often lived in the future tense. They cared about how the battlefield should look. They cared about the plan, the diagram, the ideal. Plans don't survive tempo, so the warning ran into a wall made of pride and habit. And there was another problem, a deeper one. Germany didn't just have to defend Normandy. Germany had to defend the idea of Germany. That meant nobody wanted to say out loud what Rommel's warning implied, that the Allies could force Germany into a reactive war, that Germany could be made to chase events instead of controlling them, that the initiative could be lost permanently. In a system that worshipped willpower, the idea of being forced into reaction felt like a betrayal. So they wanted comforting answers. They wanted certainty. They wanted a story where Germany could still choose the shape of the fight. Rommel was offering the opposite. He was saying, the shape is already forming and it will harden fast. Move now, or you will be moving inside your enemy's choices. That meant the warning attacked their identity. And when a warning attacks identity, it doesn't get heard. It gets rejected. So instead of adapting, they rationalized. They told themselves the Americans were clumsy. They told themselves Allied commanders were cautious. They told themselves the landing would be contained. They told themselves the situation could be managed with proper response. Proper response is slow response, and slow response is exactly what Patton was designed to punish. That meant the warning was heard, but not accepted. Rommel wasn't asking for a heroic stand. He was asking for a system that could react at the speed of reality. But a system doesn't change because one man understands danger. Systems change when they are forced. Germany wasn't forced yet. not emotionally, not internally, not at the level of belief. So they continued to operate like control was more important than speed. And that is where the ticking clock becomes visible. Because the clock wasn't just time on a calendar, it was the gap between what Rommel understood and what Germany's command culture could do. Rommel saw the battlefield as a chain of consequences. Germany's leadership treated it as a set of permissions. That meant every decision had a hidden delay, and every delay had a hidden cost. Then there's the part that sounds like a technical detail, until you realize it's the whole story. Who controlled the reserves? Reserves are not just units. Reserves are time stored as force. They are the ability to respond to an unexpected event without collapsing. They are the ability to say, we can still fix this. So the question becomes, when the crack appears, who has the authority to throw force into it immediately? If the answer is someone far away, the crack becomes a breach. If the answer is someone on the spot, you still might fail, but you at least have a chance to be relevant. Rommel wanted relevance. Germany's system produced delay. That meant the warning wasn't about Patton alone. It was about what Patton would do to a slow system the moment it blinked. So when Germany ignored the warning, they weren't choosing to be brave. They were choosing to remain slow. And slow is a choice you can only afford when your enemy is slower. Patton was not slower. Patton was hunger with wheels. He was the kind of commander who treated the map like a living thing. If it moved, he chased it. If it hesitated, he devoured it. If it broke, he widened the break until it was beyond repair. But again, the personality is a distraction. The relevant part is the rhythm. Patton's rhythm was pressure, and pressure creates mistakes. Mistakes create gaps. Gaps create tempo. Tempo creates collapse. That meant the most dangerous moment wasn't when Patton attacked a prepared defense. The most dangerous moment was when the defense was unprepared to react quickly. Rommel understood that, because Rommel had been that moment to other armies. So what did he do? He tried to drag Germany's thinking into the same reality. He tried to make them see that the war was no longer about holding a line. It was about preventing a flood. A line can be repaired. A flood can't. Because a flood doesn't just move forward, it moves around. It moves into the spaces behind you that you assumed were safe. It doesn't respect your front. It creates a new front wherever it is. That meant once the Allies broke open space, the German front would stop being a front. It would become a series of emergencies. And emergencies create more delay. Delay creates more emergencies. That's how an army collapses without losing every fight. It loses the timeline. So the question becomes, why didn't they adapt when Rommel was literally telling them what the future would feel like? Because adapting would have required admitting that the old instincts were wrong. And because admitting that was expensive, it would have required moving armor forward in a risky way. It would have required giving local commanders authority to act without permission. It would have required using fuel, ammunition, and men now, when leadership wanted to preserve them for later. Later is an illusion when tempo is against you. So they kept their resources safe. And safety became delay. And delay became defeat. That meant the most dangerous thing Germany did wasn't underestimating Patton's aggression. It was overestimating their ability to control events after the fact. Control after the fact is not control. It's coping. Now the clock tightens, because even before Patton's decisive moment, the war was already shaping itself into a tempo contest. The Allies were building a machine. Germany was trying to manage a crisis with a system designed for certainty. And certainty is the first thing tempo destroys. So when the Allies expanded, Germany's leadership demanded confirmation. They demanded reports. They demanded clarity. They demanded the battlefield behave like a file folder. The battlefield behaved like a fire. That meant the warning was not just ignored. It was overridden by procedure. And procedure is slow. So the question becomes, what happens when you're slow and your enemy is fast? First, you lose options. Then you lose positions. Then you lose confidence. Then you lose the ability to tell the difference between a setback and a collapse. Because a fast enemy doesn't let you label events comfortably. He moves on while you're still naming what happened. That meant Germany didn't just have to fight Allied forces. They had to fight the psychological effect of being late. And being late changes people. It makes commanders cautious. It makes units hesitate. It makes everyone demand more certainty before acting, exactly when certainty is least available. So the system tightens itself into paralysis. That's the trap. The faster the enemy moves, the more you crave control. The more you crave control, the slower you become. The slower you become, the faster the enemy feels. That meant tempo isn't just a tactical advantage, it's a psychological weapon. Rommel knew this. He tried to inoculate Germany against it by telling them the truth early. By telling them, don't treat speed as a detail, treat it as the main threat. But Germany's leadership had another habit, a fatal one. They treated reality as negotiable. They believed willpower could substitute for logistics. They believed ideology could substitute for flexibility. They believed authority could substitute for speed. So when Rommel presented the warning, it didn't fit their preferred story. And when information doesn't fit the preferred story, it gets filed away as pessimism. That meant Germany didn't reject Rommel because he was wrong. They rejected him because he was inconvenient. Now, the most important part. Rommel didn't need them to believe Patton was some mythic force. He needed them to believe something simpler. He needed them to believe that the decisive event would happen quickly, and once it started, it wouldn't stop politely. That meant you had to be positioned not just to fight, but to respond. You had to be ready to act before you fully understood. Because if you wait to fully understand, the enemy writes the chapter without you. And Patton was a chapter writer. So when Rommel looked at Patton, he didn't think, this man will attack. Every commander attacks. He thought, this man will expand. He thought, this man will transform an opening into open country. He thought, this man will treat hesitation as permission. That meant the warning was, don't hesitate. Germany hesitated anyway. And once hesitation becomes a habit, it doesn't disappear on command. Then the war offered Germany its test. Not a philosophical test, a practical one. A crack appears. Not a collapse, not yet. A crack, a local failure, a moment of disorganization, a gap that could be patched if you move now. And this is where tempo becomes visible, because a crack is time sensitive. If you hit it immediately, you can reseal the line. If you wait, it becomes a breach. If it becomes a breach, the enemy doesn't need to win every fight. He only needs to keep moving. That meant the crack was a question. Germany's answer was delayed. And delays don't just waste time. They create conditions the enemy can exploit. Because while you wait, the enemy is moving. While you ask permission, the enemy is already on the next road. While you build a perfect plan, the enemy is using an imperfect plan at full speed. That's how tempo works. It turns your best intentions into your worst weakness. So when the crack appeared, Rommel's logic would have demanded immediate mass, immediate movement, immediate authority exercised on the spot. But Germany's system demanded confirmation. It demanded centralized control. It demanded the battlefield slow down long enough to be managed. The battlefield did not slow down. That meant the crack did what cracks do when you ignore them. It widened. And once a crack widens, it invites the exact kind of commander Rommel feared. A commander who doesn't look at a gap and see danger. He sees invitation. He sees leverage. He sees a timeline he can steal. That meant the Patton moment wasn't just going to be an attack. It was going to be an acceleration. It was going to be the moment the war shifts from pushing to pouring, from fighting for positions to fighting for time. And Germany was already behind, because the window had closed. The ceiling of air power was there. The roads were watched. The movement was punished. The reserves that could have arrived quickly now couldn't arrive safely. That meant even if Germany wanted to respond now, the battlefield would charge them extra for every mile. and a slow system can't afford extra costs. So the warning becomes prophecy, not because it predicts the future, but because it describes what slow systems do under speed pressure. And slow systems always do the same thing. They ask for more certainty. They ask for more control. They ask for more time. Tempo gives them none of it. So the clock isn't just ticking, it's tightening. And once it tightens past a certain point, the outcome doesn't depend on genius anymore. It depends on whether you can still act at the speed of reality. Germany couldn't, and Patton was coming into the story at the exact moment when speed would matter most. Because this is what Rommel saw. If Patton gets room, he won't simply win ground, he'll win time. And if he wins time, Germany will spend the rest of the campaign reacting to things that already happened. That meant the real defeat would start before the final defeats. It would start in the mindset, in the refusal to adapt, in the choice to treat a warning as noise. Because once a system decides to ignore reality, it doesn't become safer, it becomes blind. And blind systems don't lose slowly, they lose suddenly. Before Patton moved, Patton already mattered. That sounds like myth. It wasn't. It was mechanics. Because Germany wasn't just fighting Allied divisions. Germany was fighting Allied expectations. And expectations decide where you place your strength, where you spend your time, where you keep your reserves, what you're willing to risk. So the Allies did something simple and cruel. They turned Patton into a pressure point, a ghost army, a threat that didn't need to fire a shot to shape German behavior. That meant Germany was forced to defend two wars at once, the war in front of them, and the war they feared would start tomorrow in a different place. If you make an enemy hold back strength for a threat that isn't real yet, you've already slowed them down, you've already stolen time, you've already split their attention. And splitting attention is how you weaken a system that's built on control. Patton was perfect for it, because his reputation did half the work. His name didn't imply a cautious push. His name implied acceleration, breakout, exploitation. A commander who wouldn't stop at the shoreline and ask what's next. He would ask, what's behind you? That meant even the idea of Patton created fear of open space. And fear of open space makes you cling to fixed plans. It makes you demand confirmation. It makes you keep units in hand instead of committing them to the reality that's already in motion. So when Germany hesitated, it wasn't always because they lacked courage. It was because they were trying to be correct. Correct about where the main blow would fall. Correct about when Patton would appear. Correct about which door would be kicked in. But tempo doesn't reward correctness. It rewards commitment at the right time. That meant while Germany waited to be sure, the Allies kept building. They expanded the foothold. They organized supply. They brought in more men, more fuel, more artillery, more aircraft. They turned sand and hedgerows into a machine. And every day that machine grows, the window for stopping it shrinks. That's why Rommel's warning was so sharp. He wasn't arguing about bravery, he was arguing about a calendar. Hit them before the machine finishes assembling. Because once it's assembled, it doesn't just fight you, it replaces you. So here's the irony. Germany wanted to preserve their strength for Patton, and that desire to preserve strength helped create the conditions that made Patton lethal. That meant the warning was ignored twice. First intellectually, then behaviorally. They treated tempo as a detail. They treated main threat as a guessing. They treated control as a substitute for speed. And while they did that, Allied pressure kept turning the front into a hinge. Not a wall, a hinge. Because a wall can hold, or it can break. A hinge can swing. And once the hinge swings, the entire geometry changes. That meant the decisive question wasn't, can Germany stop every attack? No army can. The decisive question was, when the hinge moves, can Germany respond fast enough to stop the swing from becoming a collapse? Rommel knew the answer if the system stayed rigid. No. And then time did what time always does. It removed the people who saw the problem clearly and left the system to defend itself. Rommel wasn't there at the moment the hinge swung. That's the cruelest part. The man who understood tempo most intimately didn't get to command the response when tempo finally arrived as a crisis. The warning stayed. The reality came. The system remained. That meant the war was about to teach the lesson without the teacher. Now look at the battlefield like a living thing. For weeks, Germany's position depended on forcing the Allies to fight in tight spaces. Hedgerows, choke points, short lines. A grinding fight where speed is hard to express. That favors the defender. It buys time. It makes every meter expensive. But grinding only works if you can keep the fight confined. If the Allies break into open country, grinding ends. The war stops being a wrestle and becomes a sprint. That meant the entire German defensive logic depended on preventing the breakout. Because a breakout is not just an advance. It is a change of phase. And phase changes punish slow systems. So when the opening appeared, when Allied pressure finally cracked the structure enough to create room, this is where Rommel's warning becomes visible. Because room is exactly what Patton was built to exploit. Room is where tempo becomes a weapon. Room is where hesitation becomes fatal. And room is where a commander who loves speed stops fighting the enemy's strengths and starts fighting the enemy's weaknesses. That meant the moment Patton got room, the question stopped being, can Germany hold the line? The question became, can Germany even form a line fast enough to be held? Because Patton didn't just attack what was in front of him, he attacked the time it took you to create in front. He attacked the interval, the delay, the space between an order and the moment that order becomes reality. That's why Rommel took him seriously, not because Patton was loud, because Patton treated time like terrain. He captured it, he held it, he used it to attack your ability to coordinate. So when Patton finally moved with space to maneuver, he didn't behave like a normal commander. He didn't advance carefully. He didn't pause to turn success into a tidy report. He did what Rommel knew he would do. He poured through. And pouring through isn't a metaphor, it's a method. A push can be resisted. A pour is different. A pour searches for low ground. It spreads. It bypasses strength. It floods behind you. It forces you to fight in every direction at once. That meant the German defense was facing a threat that didn't respect their organizational logic. A front line assumes a front. A pour creates sides, backs, gaps, and panic. And the first thing it kills is certainty. Because once Patton is in open country, every German commander has the same nightmare. Where is he going next? And that question is poison. Because if you don't know where he's going next, you don't know where to place your reserves. If you don't know where to place reserves, you either commit them too early to the wrong place, or you hold them too long and commit them too late. Either way, tempo wins. That meant Germany's worst fear wasn't Patton's spearhead by itself. It was the decisions Patton forced them to make under time pressure. Decisions with incomplete information. Decisions where being cautious is punished. Decisions where the safe choice becomes the wrong choice. So when Patton poured through, he didn't need to destroy every German unit. He needed to make German units irrelevant. To move past them, around them, into the places that make them useless. Road junctions, supply routes, bridges, communications, the arteries. That meant a German unit could still be alive, still be fighting, and still be strategically dead. Because it's fighting in the wrong place. It's fighting on yesterday's battlefield. And that is how tempo wins wars without winning every fight. Now remember the system failure. Germany's command structure had delays built into it. Authority was centralized. Permission was precious. Orders traveled. Reports traveled. Requests traveled. Patton traveled faster than all of it. That meant by the time Germany understood what was happening, Patton had already created a new problem further down the road. And by the time they tried to solve that, he created another. This is the nightmare loop. You react to point A. Patton is already at point B. You rush to point B. Patton is already shaping point C. You start moving reserves. Air power makes that movement expensive. You hesitate. Patton grows. That meant every German decision felt like it arrived late. And late decisions create desperate decisions. Desperate decisions create messy movement. Messy movement is what Allied aircraft and artillery feast on. So the system starts punishing itself. This is where Germany paid in days. Because a fast enemy doesn't just take ground. He steals the future. He forces you to spend tomorrow fixing today. And then he hits you tomorrow anyway. That meant the Germans weren't just losing positions. They were losing the ability to plan. And when an army loses the ability to plan, it becomes reactive. It becomes a fire brigade, not a fort. It runs from crisis to crisis until it runs out of fuel, cohesion, and belief. Now look at Patton's instinct in open space. A normal commander sees a breakthrough and thinks, we need to consolidate. Patton saw a breakthrough and thought, we need to multiply. Multiply confusion, multiply speed, multiply pressure. Multiply the number of problems the enemy must solve at once. Because an enemy can solve one problem, sometimes two. But if you give him 5 and each one is time sensitive, he won't solve any cleanly. He will choose the least awful option, and then you punish that choice. That meant Patton didn't need to guess perfectly. He just needed to be faster than Germany's ability to correct. So when he poured through, he split. He fanned out. He threatened multiple directions. He created the impression of being everywhere, because in operational terms, he was. He forced German commanders to protect rear areas they didn't even want to think about. He forced them to pull units out of prepared positions to chase moving threats. He forced them to detach pieces from formations, breaking cohesion, to patch holes that kept changing location. That meant the German defense stopped being a defense and became a series of improvisations. Improvisation is fine when you have time. Improvisation is lethal when your enemy is sprinting. So every time Germany tried to form a response, the response arrived late, fragmented, and exposed. Patton didn't just exploit gaps in the line, he exploited gaps in time. So when Rommel said, "Give him space and he will turn it into collapse," this is what he meant. Not that Patton would magically win. That Patton would change the tempo so violently that Germany would begin losing without realizing how quickly it was happening. Because it doesn't feel like a collapse at first. It feels like a series of setbacks. A road lost here, a bridge threatened there, a unit cut off, a headquarters relocating, a fuel dump destroyed, a signal line down, a reserve redirected. Small things, normal things, until you realize they aren't isolated anymore. They are connected by one invisible thread. You are late to all of them. That meant the collapse didn't start with a dramatic surrender. It started with lateness becoming permanent. And permanence is what turns a setback into a catastrophe. Now layer in the psychological effect. When a fast enemy is in your rear, every rumor feels plausible. Every report feels urgent. Every commander starts seeing threats that might not even be there. So you overreact, you underreact, you freeze, you move, you stop, you move again. And every motion becomes visible from the air. That meant even the act of trying to regain control creates more targets. So the system starts bleeding from its own effort. And all of this happens while Patton keeps moving. Because movement itself is his weapon. A slower enemy wants you to pause. A slower enemy wants you to settle. A slower enemy wants you to become predictable. Patton refused. So if you want the purest expression of Rommel's warning, it's this. Germany's leadership believed they could manage the battle through control. Patton proved control is worthless if you can't act in time. That meant the Patton threat wasn't a single spear. It was a tempo field, a pressure environment, a constant forcing function. And now, Germany had to do the one thing their system was worst at: adapt in real time. Not tomorrow, not after paperwork, not after a conference, now. But the window was already closed. Air power above, roads watched, communications strained, reserves delayed, authority centralized. So even when Germany did act, they acted expensively. They moved under threat. They moved piecemeal. They moved too late. That meant the Allies didn't just defeat German units, they defeated German timing. And once timing is defeated, everything else follows. Because timing is what makes strength useful. A strong unit in the wrong place is weakness. A perfect plan executed late is failure. A reserve that arrives after the breakthrough is not a reserve, it's a witness. So when Patton poured through, he didn't have to be perfect. He only had to keep Germany in a state of catching up. And catching up is where armies die. Not always physically, organizationally, mentally, logistically. The war becomes a chase, and a chase is a fight you lose simply by staying behind. That meant the decisive loss wasn't a single battle. It was the moment Germany lost the timeline. Rommel understood that losing the timeline was the real defeat. Germany ignored him. And Patton did exactly what a tempo commander does when you hand him open space. He turned movement into collapse. By the time people realized what was happening, the story was already written in the only language tempo respects: sequence. Not what you intended to do, what you did first, what you did late, what you never did at all. That meant the breakthrough wasn't the decisive event. The decisive event was the acceleration that followed it. Because a breakthrough is still a problem you can solve, acceleration is a problem that multiplies while you're solving it. So when Patton poured through, Germany didn't just lose ground. They lost the ability to choose where ground would matter. That's why the price was paid in days. Miles are reversible, days aren't. You can retake a road if you still have a coherent army. You can counterattack a position if your units still move as a system. You can rebuild a line if your command structure still produces decisions that arrive before the situation changes. But once you lose days, you lose the chance to do those things in the order they require. Because war is not a list of tasks you can complete whenever you feel ready. War is tasks that expire. That meant every hour Germany delayed early became an hour they could not buy back later, no matter how hard they fought. And that is the quiet brutality of modern operational war. A commander like Patton doesn't just take what you have, he takes what you are going to have. He steals your next position. He steals your next decision. He steals your next plan. So you're not just losing the present, you're losing the future. That meant Germany's collapse didn't need to look dramatic. It only needed to be irreversible. And irreversibility is what happens when the timeline belongs to your enemy. Now look at the dominoes. Once Patton is moving in open country, the rear becomes a battlefield. Not because he is everywhere, because he can threaten enough places that you must act as if he is everywhere. That forces a system into panic behavior. Headquarters shift. Units are redirected mid-march. Fuel is rerouted. Artillery is repositioned. Communications become overloaded with urgent messages that compete with each other. Officers try to create order by demanding reports. Reports arrive late. So the attempt to regain control becomes the thing that slows you down further. That meant the more Germany tried to be organized, the more they fed the machine that was unmaking them. Because tempo punishes bureaucracy. Patton didn't have to outthink every German commander. He only had to be faster than the German system. And once he was, Germany started losing in the background. Not just at the point of contact, but in the invisible infrastructure of war. A supply convoy that can't reach its destination. A bridge destroyed before the unit crosses. A road jammed with mixed formations trying to move two directions at once. A unit that receives an order that no longer matches the situation. A commander who doesn't know whether to obey the last order or the last reality. That meant German strength began arriving out of phase. Out of phase is how power becomes useless. A tank battalion that reaches the wrong crossroads at the wrong time is not a tank battalion. It's a collection of targets. And targets don't slow down a commander who's sprinting. So day by day, the Germans were forced into decisions that felt rational in isolation and disastrous in sequence. Hold here to stop the spearhead, but if you hold there, your flank opens. Move reserves to protect the rear. But if you move reserves, the front weakens. Counterattack the penetration. But if you counterattack too late, you expose yourself to air power and artillery, while Patton simply shifts. Withdraw to shorten the line. But if you withdraw, you concede roads that accelerate the enemy even more. That meant every option had a cost, and tempo made every cost higher. And air power was the tax collector. Because once the Allies owned the sky, German movement became a gamble. Movement is necessary to respond to tempo, but movement under observation and attack turns into attrition. So to respond fast, you take losses. To avoid losses, you respond slow. Either way, tempo. That meant the Germans were trapped in a dilemma Rommel had tried to warn them about. Move early, before air power locks the roads, and you still have freedom. Move late, and you pay for every mile with men and machines you cannot replace quickly. Germany moved late, so even when they tried to adapt, the battlefield punished them for the delay that already happened. That's why time matters more than territory. Because territory is just the surface. Time is the structure underneath. Now consider the mental shift that happens when you're late for long enough. At first, you feel unlucky. Then you feel pressured. Then you feel hunted. And then you start making defensive decisions that aren't about winning. They're about avoiding being blamed. You demand more certainty before acting. You cling to orders even when they don't match reality. You avoid initiative because initiative without permission is dangerous in a rigid system. That meant Germany's command culture, already centralized, already cautious about authority, became even more paralyzed under speed pressure. And that paralysis is exactly what Patton's tempo exists to exploit. Because tempo is not only movement. Tempo is the enemy's inability to commit. If the enemy is afraid to commit, you can threaten multiple directions and force them to split. If they split, you hit the weakest point. If they try to concentrate, you shift and hit another. That meant Patton was turning Germany's uncertainty into a weapon against itself. This is why the campaign can feel like it suddenly changes. It isn't sudden, it's cumulative. Once enough small delays stack, you pass a threshold. Past that threshold, recovery becomes almost impossible because every attempt to recover creates new vulnerabilities. That's the domino effect. And once dominoes start falling, the question stops being, can we stop them? The question becomes, can we stop the next one in time? Germany couldn't, so the price in days becomes visible. Every day the Allies advance under momentum, Germany is not just losing ground. Germany is losing the opportunity to rebuild a coherent defensive line. They don't have time to dig in properly. They don't have time to synchronize units arriving from different directions. They don't have time to rest exhausted formations. They don't have time to repair communications. They don't have time to stockpile ammunition at the right points. That meant even when they set a line, the line is thin, unstable, undersupplied, built out of fragments. And fragmentary lines don't survive a commander who knows how to turn pressure into rupture. So the whole system becomes a race between German stabilization and Allied acceleration. Patton's entire style is built to win that race. Not by being perfect, by being relentless. Because relentlessness creates fatigue. Fatigue creates mistakes. Mistakes create gaps. Gaps create more speed. That meant once Patton's tempo takes hold, it becomes self-feeding. And that is the part Rommel understood instinctively. Not as a theory, as lived experience. Rommel had done this to others. He had watched enemies buckle because they couldn't catch the pace. He had watched them begin to fight the last movement instead of the next movement. He had watched them lose cohesion not because they lacked courage, but because they lacked time. So when he warned Germany, he was trying to prevent them from experiencing what he had inflicted. Germany ignored him, and then Germany experienced it. Now the only honest question left is the one people always ask when a collapse happens. Could it have been avoided? Not could Germany have won. Could the collapse have been slowed? Could time have been bought? Because buying time is sometimes the only victory available. And time was the currency Rommel was trying to keep. So what would buying time have required? Not miracle weapons. Not perfect intelligence. Not a sudden change in Allied strength. It would have required one thing Germany's system resisted: adaptation before proof. Because the moment you have proof, you're already late. That meant the first requirement would have been placing the right force close enough to respond immediately without waiting for a chain of permissions. Local authority that can act in hours. Reserves position for reality, not for theory. A willingness to spend fuel and risk equipment to prevent open space from forming. Not because risk is good, because delayed safety is fatal. That would have been expensive. It would have required accepting casualties and losses earlier to prevent larger losses later. It would have required a system that treats field commanders like decision makers, not like messengers. It would have required Germany to stop pretending the war could be controlled by distant certainty. In other words, it would have required Germany to change what it was. That meant the counterfactual isn't really about tactics, it's about identity. Germany could have bought time if Germany could have tolerated decentralization, if Germany could have tolerated admitting weakness, if Germany could have tolerated saying, "Rommel is right, and that means we must change immediately." But those were not small asks, they were existential. So in reality, the question, why didn't they adapt, has the same answer every time it appears in history. Because adaptation feels like surrender before the battle is visibly lost. But tempo doesn't wait for visible loss. Tempo creates it. So the truth is this: Germany didn't lose solely because Patton was fast. Germany lost because a rigid system cannot survive against a fast opponent once open space appears. Rommel understood that open space was the fatal condition. Patton exploited it. And Germany's leadership treated the warning like a disagreement instead of a deadline. That meant the loss wasn't only on the battlefield. It was in ignoring reality. It was in believing that control could replace speed. It was in believing that authority could replace adaptation. It was in believing that the timeline could be negotiated. Rommel knew it couldn't. Because the timeline in war is not a schedule you choose. It's a schedule you seize. And once your enemy seizes it, you don't get it back by wanting it. You only get it back by acting faster than you feel comfortable acting. Germany didn't. So the verdict is simple. Rommel recognized Patton because Rommel recognized tempo. He saw the pattern. He saw the logic. He saw the chain reaction before it became visible. And Germany ignored him because the warning demanded a kind of flexibility the system couldn't afford psychologically. They wanted a war they could manage. They got a war that moved. That meant Patton didn't just defeat German units, he defeated German timing. And timing is what makes everything else possible. So when people ask, why did Germany lose so quickly in that phase, they often look for a single dramatic mistake. But the mistake wasn't one moment, it was a habit. The habit of being slow. The habit of demanding certainty. The habit of treating warnings as noise until reality forces the lesson. Rommel tried to teach the lesson early. Germany chose to learn it late. And late learning in war looks like collapse. Because once the timeline belongs to your enemy, the outcome follows. And here's the part that should bother you. Rommel didn't lose this argument because he lacked evidence. He lost it because evidence wasn't the problem. The problem was what the evidence demanded: a change in posture, a change in control, a change in tempo. Germany's leadership didn't ignore Rommel because they didn't hear him. They ignored him because hearing him meant admitting something they couldn't afford to admit: that the war was about to be decided by speed, not by certainty. That meant the real defeat wasn't the moment the line broke. It was the moment they chose to treat time like it was infinite. Because once Patton had space, he didn't just take ground. He took the calendar. He took the schedule. He turned German decisions into reactions, and reactions are always late. So when people ask why it happened so fast, the answer isn't Patton was unstoppable. The answer is simpler. Germany made the warning expensive, so they rejected it. And then they paid the price anyway, only later, only bigger, only with interest. That meant Rommel's real warning was never, "Watch Patton." It was, if you don't adapt, Patton will decide the timeline. And once the timeline belongs to your enemy, the outcome follows. If you want more stories like this, where war is explained as cause and consequence, where the details actually matter, subscribe. Because history doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it does repeat its patterns. And this pattern is one of the oldest there is. Reality sends a warning, a system denies it, then reality collects.